Good afternoon. Welcome to another KSB webinar. I'm Brian Jordan, Deputy Director here at the Kansas Association of School Boards. There's several staff members working with us behind the scenes to pull this webinar off. We will be hearing from Angie Stallbaumer, our Assistant Executive Director for Legal Services today throughout the program as well. So as we put this as we put this webinar together, we did it with some thought given to the challenges that local boards are facing with the unknowns or the multitude of unknowns that are happening right now in your communities as you try to reopen schools. We know that some things were released just this week that are going to impact what you do with your schools. And so we want to try to start to unpack some of those things as we go through the conversation today with you. So as you all are fully aware, hopefully, since you're on this webinar, the State Board of Education this week approved the Navigating Change document, which includes guidance for school districts as they work to reopen their schools. If you haven't had a chance to look at that yet, that document is about 1,000 pages in length and has many sections that are applicable to the reopening schools. Our word of caution to all of you is don't try to print that thing off, because your printer will get worn out trying to do that. But then also be very strategic as you try to roll this plan out and make sure that the varying groups that are in your districts working on this actually are working on the appropriate sections of that plan. So part of our outcomes today are to try to figure out how to help you begin to unpack the guidance that's in this document. I can't emphasize enough that the document itself is guidance, not necessarily requirements that school districts have to do. A key thing to keep in mind with this is you're going to have to unpack that guidance. You're going to have conversations around your board table with your educational leaders. What's our best approach going forward as we work to reopen schools? So I want to touch on some of the outcomes that we're going to discuss today. And the outcomes that we put together were based on our discussions internally around what we know school boards are facing in their local districts. We got plenty of feedback from board members across the state on what they were struggling with. We've also worked with superintendents and listened to their concerns. Our KASB Board of Directors have said we need some support out there for school board members around how to deal with change, how to deal with the unknowns that they're struggling with. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about change at the beginning of this session and the areas of leadership we know that suffer anytime we lead through what's called second order change. Culture, communication, order, and input are areas of leadership that suffer anytime we're trying to take on a change as monumental as what we're working through right now. We also want to talk a little bit about the structure of that guidance that the State Board of Education approved and released this week. Basically give you the high level view of what's in there so that you can be more intentional and strategic with using your focus groups, your stakeholder groups in your district to put together a viable plan. We want to talk a little bit about some issues or some things to keep in mind as you think about instructional opportunities for kids going forward, as well as what the operations have to look like as you put the reopening plan together in your local district. And finally, we want to talk a little bit about some roadmap to reopening resources that we've put together at KASB that can be utilized by your reopening groups or the groups that are focusing on developing those plans. And then Angie Stallbaumer is also going to talk about some possible next steps that are going to be happening over the next week to 14 days from a State Board of Education perspective and from the governor's most recent executive orders. So some key things as we put this plan together with our staff in conjunction with United School Administrators, there's some key points that we believe educational leaders need to emphasize as they work in their local district. One of the things that's most important to keep in mind is we don't know exactly what reopening schools will look like 45, 60 days from now. We know that things have changed dramatically since school was dismissed in May. And we have no idea what we know is going to happen in September when we go back to school. The key here is keep in mind that the process of planning is just as important as the plans that you put in place. As you put those plans in place, approach it from a mindset of this is an opportunity for us to continue to improve our system, continue to learn from things that we did last spring, and really try hard not to place blame or victimize or villainize others in this process because that's wasted time and energy as we move forward. We know that we're going to have to be patient. We're going to have to preach flexibility as we go forward because we don't know what it's going to look like 3 months from now. And so flexibility and that process of planning is just as important as developing that solid plan. It's going to be critical that you build relationships with your local decision makers, such as your county health departments, your city councils, your county commissioners, possibly even your neighboring school districts, to think about how we execute our plans for reopening our school and then support kids and staff once we get back in session. And then finally, we're going to talk about how to use that KSD guidance that is out there as a starting point for discussion and planning efforts that are going on in your district. So let's start off and talk a little bit about change. And before I jump into this, I want to make sure that you have a piece of scratch paper near you. I hope that you've also taken the opportunity to download the roadmap for reopening document that we put out there earlier in the week, because that's going to be referenced throughout this. If you haven't, don't worry, we'll put some of the key points of that up here on the screen as we go through those. But if you have that, you can make some notes there as you view from your location. So before I put this next slide up there, take a moment and think about what's going on in your district right now. Now I want you to think about how has that impacted you personally? What feelings do you get internally when you start to think about all the changes that are happening locally or going to be happening locally? You all, as leaders in your community, are expected to be the voice, expected to be the stable guiding vision for what that school is going to look like when the doors open. Think about what that change means to the families that are out there with a kid that's never been in your elementary schools, and they're thinking about sending their kid to kindergarten for the first time. Think about how they feel about the changes and the unknowns that are out there. Think about that kid that's transitioning from a middle school going into that high school for the first time, and the changes and what they're feeling as they go through this. We all as leaders hope that we can provide that stable vision. We hope that we can be level-headed and really try to put together a thoughtful plan to reopen our schools. So we know anytime we're trying to lead through second order change, or excuse me, as we lead through change, there's parts of our leadership that are going to suffer. And so this is an acronym I want you to write down, CCOI. Anytime you're leading through a change as monumental as what we're going through, there's going to be parts of your culture that suffer. And we know right now our culture in our school districts is suffering from the unknowns. We don't necessarily know if the vision that we have for our schools can be executed in the way that we would like that to happen. So our culture begins to suffer, morale begins to suffer a little bit because people are frustrated. We can't just jump back in and do what we've always done. We also know that our culture is greatly impacted by the communication that people receive and the way that people are hearing that information. They have a filter as they hear that information, and they filter that through their perceptions of the changes that are coming. So we know communication is going to be impacted. We're going to get tired of communicating, but we need to continue to communicate. And I will remind you that communication not only means us telling people what it's going to look like, but us also listening to understand where they're at and how they're taking that information in. We also know that anytime we're leading through a change as monumental as what we're going through, the order of what we've traditionally done is going to be altered. We know that we're not going to be able to open schools in the fashion that we've traditionally done. So the processes that we've used, the policies that we've used, the rules that we've always relied on to keep that order in place are going to have to shift. So we know that the order that we've relied on is going to suffer as we go through opening our schools. And then finally, people never feel like they have enough input. That's what the I stands for when there's a monumental change like this happening. So we encourage you to think about how can we pull more people into this conversation and help them understand how we're trying to shift the culture in a direction that allows our kids to be safe, our staff to be safe, and for our students can continue to progress with their educational outcomes. So let's talk a little bit more about why people struggle so much as we try to lead through changes as monumental as this. There's some fancy acronyms out there called first order, second order change, but it really boils down to four general areas. So when we think about school opening up in the fall, in a traditional sense, folks kind of know enrollment happens in late July. We go to the school, we meet the kids' teachers, we take their supplies, we put them in the desk. We know the next step is school's going to open up within the next week. We'll drop the kids off, we'll pick them up at the end of the day. Everybody pretty much understands that. Most all of us have been through public education or schools, so we kind of understand what that looks like. The reality is with what we're facing, there's a huge break from our past practices. And that causes anxiety. Think about that change slide I just showed. Think about your feelings. Now think about your parent that doesn't know, well, how am I going to get that relationship established with my teacher? Or that student that's going into the high school for the first time, how am I going to learn, who my teachers are and how they like to interact with their students? Another thing that people struggle with anytime you lead through a change that's as monumental as this is they fail sometimes to see the bigger picture. So it's going to be very difficult for people to understand the complexity of trying to offer all these different learning areas, such as on-site, remote, hybrid. And so in a traditional sense, people knew that, hey, we went to school, this is the progression of the day, this is the schedule that we use, and it was pretty standard. Now we're going to have to help people understand what's it look like if we go to a hybrid schedule? What's it look like if we're doing remote learning? And how is my student going to be successful moving forward in that? Another area where people struggle is the norms that we've traditionally relied on for communication, for maintaining order, for maintaining the right culture are now shifting. And so I feel a sense of loss of what I've always known, what I could rely on and I had comfort in. That's all changed. And that's going to be a challenge that we have to think about as leaders. How do we start to bring some order? How do we start to establish new norms as we transition to these different models or modes of learning? And then finally, people are going to struggle with, what do I need to do? So we know from a small sampling last spring when we went to continuous learning, there were some major gaps from the continuous learning standpoint in the areas of technology, people's ability to access what they needed in a timely fashion, folks' ability to get what they needed to be successful with their students in their home environment. And so people were learning on the fly how to access a Zoom meeting, how to troubleshoot a technology piece of equipment that I've never even seen before when my kid brings that home. So there's going to have to be new knowledge and skills that people have to embrace or have to learn as we go forward. So as we think about shifting into reopening schools, you need to plan for those new knowledge pieces and skills that folks are going to need as they reopen their schools. So let's move forward and talk a little bit about, sorry, I'm having a little bit of a technical glitch here. There we go. Let's talk a little bit about those four areas again of communication, culture, order, and input. We know that anytime we lead through a difficult change like we're facing, these four areas suffer, and it stems from these things being disrupted. These are the critical areas of leadership where we have to start. How are we communicating? How are we listening? How are we getting information out there so that it's meeting people where they are? I know a lot of times as leaders, we believe we've done a great job of communicating and why aren't these people hearing it? The reality is if they're not hearing it, you haven't communicated it in the right mechanism or the right way to meet them where they are. We know that people are going to feel like their whole world, their whole culture has changed. Think about all the things that people relied on and look forward to as school reopens, activities, meeting their teachers. All of that's going to be shifting and changing as we think about reopening. And then that order connects directly to that. And then finally, input in the process. You know, in the traditional sense of schools, we've relied on site councils, we've relied on district administration, we relied on boards to help shape what it looks like. We have to expand that structure and get input from folks because that's going to help with them seeing the big picture. That's going to help provide some order for them going forward. So we're going to put you into a breakout room here in just a minute. But before we do that, we're going to assign some simple roles so that when we come back out and use the chat feature on the Zoom, we collect some insights. We also can hear and see what other folks were talking about in their meetings. So when you get into your breakout rooms, we're going to need somebody to step up and be the reporter. We're also going to need somebody to act as what we call the recorder. So that's the person that when you come out of this, we want the recorder to put their information in the chat room. The timekeeper is a person that just kind of keeps the sense of, okay, we're going to go into these breakout rooms for 10 minutes. That timekeeper needs to kind of keep an eye on the clock, trying to make sure that people have an opportunity to speak and be engaged. And then finally, be an active participant. What that simply means is when we get into the breakout rooms, please unmute yourself and turn your video camera on so that you can see people, you can hear people and interact with them. So as we transition into the breakout rooms, here's going to be your task. I want you to reflect for a moment and think about all those things that I just talked about related to what we call a second order change or a change as monumental as reopening schools. What are some of the new pieces of knowledge that people and families and stakeholders are going to have? What are some of the values that people or the norms that people have that may be disrupted because of the changes that we're going to experience? And then finally, how do we help people see that bigger picture of what we're trying to do to keep kids and staff safe and trying to make sure that kids are going to be able to continue on their learning path. So I'm going to be quiet for a moment, jot down a couple of thoughts related to how norms will be shifted, how we help people see that bigger picture, and how folks may need some new knowledge or skills to be able to even comprehend the changes that we're going to undertake here as we reopen schools. Like folks have come back in from your breakout rooms, we'll encourage you to put any discussion points in the chat. We're a little bit too large to do to try to bounce around and do share outs as a whole group, but hopefully it was a productive conversation around new knowledge that we need to support and get out there to our stakeholders. What communication do we need to be sharing with folks? And then of course, how do we help establish some order with the new norms that we have to put in place as we try to reopen schools? So I'm going to jump back over here to our presentation. The quote that you see up here on the screen is directly from the reopening guidance that the State Board of Education has put out there. And I think there's some key things to think about as we go forward. The only certainty that we have at this point is that we know it's going to look different. And the other key things that we need to keep in mind as we move forward is that we have to keep kids at the front of this conversation and what their needs are. So as we go forward and think about this guidance that the State Department of Education has put out there, these are the two overarching questions that this group really focused in on as they put this together. A little bit of background around the reopening guidance that was put together in May. There was a group assembled to discuss and start to map out what would competencies look like for our students if we had to shift into a continuous learning platform or continuous learning model again. And I'll talk a little bit more about what competencies are here in just a moment. And then the next step in this process of developing this guidance from KSDE was to push that out to a larger group in the month of June. In the month of June, about 1,000 educators and professionals from across the state were assembled to really dive into, okay, so from an operations standpoint, how do we ensure the safety of our kids, our students, and our staff and our community members as we reopen schools? And then how do we make sure that we have as little disruption in our educational opportunities for kids as possible? That group of 1,000 educators and professionals included teachers, principals, superintendents, school board members, healthcare professionals as they put this plan together. As I mentioned earlier, this document is about 1,000 plus pages, not about, it is 1,000 plus pages long. So it can be very overwhelming if you think you're going to sit down and read it in one reading. So we're going to talk a little bit about how do you actually use this document and be productive with all the information that's in there. So the document has, this is the table of contents from the document, gives you the overall general structure. What we're encouraging districts to do is to think about your team that's developing your reopening plans. What key pieces of information do I need to pull from this document and share with those different teams that are developing the reopening plans? For example, if your teachers are out there working on what that continuous learning looks like and what those competencies look like, they're going to need to spend most of their time in the grade bands. So your K through 2 teachers would pull that specific section and have conversations around what those look like. Your food service, transportation, those folks that are responsible for the physical plan of your school district are going to spend most of their time in the operations, which is about 40 pages long. The bulk of this document is on instruction and those grade level bands that are in there. So if you happen to go out and look at that document on the State Department's website, page 991 is operations, and then the appendices are after that, but the bulk of it is on instruction and what we need to make sure and do for kids going forward. So some key things to keep in mind as you look at this document, but as you also think about what we need to put in place for our kids in the fall. We know that there is going to need to be a blend of learning environments for our students, and these are referenced in that document. On-site learning environment is what we kind of traditionally think about kids going to the building. But in the sense of this fall, it's going to require social distancing. There's some recommendations in there about PPE or mask and other gear. We also know that we're going to have families, I'm jumping to the right side of the screen up there, that want remote learning as the environment for their students. And so when we talk about remote learning, we're talking about students engaging with their teacher, engaging with their content through an online platform. And then finally, there's a hybrid environment that's out there in between the two. And that hybrid environment is a blend of on-site as well as remote learning for students. Districts need to think about all three of these learning environments as they plan to reopen. We know there's going to be districts out there that have to quickly shift or change the environment that they're offering to their students because of outbreaks or things that may happen. Another key piece to think about with these different learning environments is what about the equity and access that our students have? As we went through the spring with the continuous learning plans that were very quickly put in place, we learned a lot about what we needed to provide from an access standpoint and an equity standpoint for our students. And when I talk about equity, I'm talking about, think about your students that come from an at-risk background. Think about your students that have special education IEPs or a 504. How do we ensure that they have the access that they need and that they're getting the equitable educational opportunities that all the rest of our students are getting within our system? So when you look at this document, you really have to think about how do we deliver a quality education and continue to allow students to progress given these three different learning environments. So the document, when you dive into it, starts off with the funding of remote learning. And there's a couple of key things to keep in mind when we talk about remote learning. The student has to be enrolled in that remote learning on September 21st. We all know that September 20th is the count date traditionally in Kansas. So that remote learning, the documentation that we have to supply around that is so that we have an accurate FTE count of our students. The students in the remote learning platform need to be able to access the same learning standards and competencies as students that are on site. So looks very similar from a content standpoint, looks very different from a delivery standpoint. Also, a key component of remote learning is there has to be daily connection with the teacher. And another component is there needs to be a log maintained that's signed off on by the parent or the guardian of the student, as well as the teacher that's delivering the remote learning opportunity. The next area of this document is the instruction. And as I mentioned, the bulk of this document falls in the instruction section. So literally from about page 10 to page 991 is all focused on instruction. And when you dive into that instruction area, it's broken up into what they call grade bands. Grade bands are what you see listed across the top there. So they've clustered K through 2, 3 through 5, 6 through 8. That doesn't necessarily mean that's how you have to configure your schools. You have to look at your system and think about how you're currently configured and what maybe adjustments need to be made. For example, if your elementary schools are only K through 4, you probably need to have a conversation, or your teachers need to have a conversation around how do we make sure that the competencies K through 4 are addressed, but maybe 5th through 8th is how you have to adjust and develop those competencies within your system. We've highlighted a few key areas within this instruction section that we believe are starting points for conversation. Number one is that access and equity piece that I just talked about on the previous slide. How do we ensure that all students have access to the learning opportunities that they need for their specific needs and their ways of being successful within our system? Another key piece of this to keep in mind is the social, emotional, and character development of our students. We know that our students and staff have been greatly impacted by not being able to be in the building and developing those relationships and having that interaction with their peers. And then finally, there's another key section in there to look at that talks about implementation and examples. So in this section, there's examples of how these grade bands can be assessed, how teachers can collaborate across different curricular areas to ensure that those competencies are being delivered. So I want to take a moment here and talk a little bit about what does this whole competency concept mean? So when the State Department put together their team back in May to talk about these competencies, here's what we're talking about as we define competencies. This comes directly out of the guidance. A competency is based on state standards, but bridges across multiple subject areas. A competency tends to be more personalized to the student's interest and tends to be across multiple subject areas for that competency. So for example, if a student's in elementary school, a teacher that's teaching math might also couple that with a science project, and they're getting some of their math standards covered along with their science standards for a project that they're doing or the work that they're engaged in. Also, there's multiple ways typically with a competency for a student to demonstrate their mastery, and that's an important piece to keep in mind. We know that if we have students in a remote learning environment, a traditional paper pencil test may not be available. So is there a project? Is there a different modality for a student to demonstrate that they've mastered the concepts that the teacher was teaching? And with competency-based education, it's based on mastery versus based on a letter grade traditionally. So comparing that with what we talk about with the traditional sense of how we delivered education, there's kind of the opposite of what a more traditional education model looks like. So here again, we're gonna transition for a quick conversation. I want you to reflect on all students' opportunities to advance academically this past spring. So when we shifted very quickly to continuous learning in the spring, we know we had some gaps. And when I talk about all students, I want you to think about students that come from a background that that is considered at risk, or a student coming from a background where they have some special education needs. How do we make sure and address their access and equity as we transition into reopening schools this fall? So the question that we're going to have you reflect on here in just a moment in your breakout room is, what needs to change to ensure all students have access to advance academically this fall, given these different learning environments? So we know that a family may choose to put their student into a remote learning environment, but that student has an IEP. Or a family may choose to have their student in a hybrid learning environment because of health concerns and exposure in the school building, but they still need to have some service and support from staff in an on-site setting. So what we'd like for you to talk about is that guiding question that you see up there. What needs to change to ensure all students have access as we open school this fall? Okay, welcome back from your breakout session. Hopefully it was a productive conversation around how you need to ensure access for all students as we think to reopen schools this fall. I'm going to share the screen here again, and I'll remind you as I'm shifting over here back to the PowerPoint, make sure and add any of the key ideas, key points into the chat so that we can share that information after this session has been completed. The next area of the guidance that I want to touch on is the operations section of the document. In that operations section, you'll notice some things there that are really more the nuts and bolts of running a school district. And what people think about as we look at operations is, well, how do we do transportation if we're doing a hybrid model? So there's going to have to be some creative solutions that districts consider and come up with. I know there's districts out there that have started to put plans together. There's going to have to be some conversations around how we handle co-curricular and extracurricular eligibility if a student is in that hybrid model or in that remote learning environment. We're going to quickly transition you back into a conversation for some discussion around how do we handle health and classroom space and transitions for students given the range or continuum of learning environments that our students are going to have. The question that we want you to think about, you see there at the bottom of the screen, is what efficiencies or opportunities for partnerships might emerge. And I want to take a moment to explain what we mean by efficiencies. When people see the word efficiency, they immediately jump to dollars. But in this sense, I want you to think about efficiency in terms of what are we going to do in the fall when we know substitute teachers aren't going to be available and we have to have teachers for students? Are there some efficiencies in the form of sharing a staff member in a remote learning environment with a neighboring school district? Is there an opportunity for a partnership within our community? If we need more space to socially distance students, is there a partnership that emerges with maybe a local church or another entity in your community that has space that you could actually have your classes held within? Is there things that you can look at from an efficiency standpoint of food service and getting the meals to the kids versus trying to shuffle all the kids through a cafeteria space where we know social distancing is going to be very difficult and going to be next to impossible to try to do in the traditional sense. So we're going to put you right back into a quick breakout discussion and think about the operations side and how that's impacted in these learning environments. Are there efficiencies or opportunities for partnerships that you're already starting to think about or that you need to discuss around your board table and with your planning team when you get back home in your district? Okay, welcome back from your breakouts. I do understand and have some empathy. I know there's a lot more questions, it seems like, at this point than we have answers. We were just chatting while you were in your breakout rooms around the power of the knowledge of the group that's on this meeting. There's a lot of ideas and what ifs and how could we and ideas that get shared. Hopefully you're finding some information and some pieces that you can take back and discuss it around your board table and with your planning teams. I'll remind you to make sure you're posting key points or ideas or questions that came up during your discussion in the chat. I'm going to flip us back over to the presentation here. I'm going to give you just one more piece of information that's out there in the guidance document. There is an appendices section of the guidance document that has Department of Health references, also has some information from a Kansas COVID work group from kids. It's made up mostly of medical professionals and folks that talk about some key things that need to be considered as you put your plans together. I'm going to transition things over to Angie Stallbaumer. She's going to talk a little bit about what's coming from a state level perspective based on the information we learned this week, or based on the announcement this week of the governor's executive order. So Angie?
All right, thank you. I promise I'm a much better attorney than I am an IT person, so hopefully this goes a little smoother than our breakout room transitions. You know, I know you've all experienced a lot of change and a lot of, you feel like you're pretty set up and the ground moves beneath your feet. So what I'm hoping to do here in just a few minutes is give you a little bit of a feel for what we believe to be the governor's authority to do what she did, what any limits to that authority may be, and then just some extraneous issues that are coming up. And feel free to put questions in the chat and I will try to address those as best I can in moving forward. So with that in mind, I think many of you know that our Governor Kelly put out a statement earlier saying that she would have executive orders issued sometime next week. So I think the goal was to get an executive order out on Monday. Now, what I would tell you with that is that there was some legislation at the tail end of the legislative session. So through House Bill 2016, there were some modifications to what the governor's authority is to declare orders during a disaster emergency period. So what we have is we have a situation where when the governor says that she needs to close public schools, and for anyone that did not hear the announcement was made that she intends to issue an executive order first to talk about closing public schools until September 9th to ensure that schools did not reopen until that point. The second aspect of what she discussed doing was essentially ensuring some of the recommendations made in the Navigating Change document provided by KSDE, such as wearing masks and using hand sanitizer and things like that, were actually put into an order. So they had more force and effect than just a suggestion under that document. So those were the things that intended to be expressed. And let me just be clear that none of us have seen a copy of that order. So we are really just guessing at this point based off of what we have heard from the governor, what's been relayed to KSDE and what's been relayed to us. So with that in mind, looking back on House Bill 2016, there were some limits put in place to say that if the governor, through executive order, attempted to close public or private school attendance centers, that action must be affirmed by the state board. Okay, so the state board is going to have to receive those orders, and I would anticipate once the state board receives them, they're going to need some time to process the orders before calling a special meeting. So I think it's putting a little too much emphasis on timeliness probably to expect them to have a meeting by Monday. I think probably a goal is going to be that they have the meeting by the end of the week, but I do believe the state board will probably take some measures to solicit, ideas from their constituents before they act on anything. So it could be later still than that. So just keep that in mind. We will not necessarily have an effective order. We will not necessarily have an answer on Monday as to how we're going to handle this and moving forward. There is the possibility, although I don't know how remote that possibility is, that the state board would choose not to affirm the action, but that is absolutely out there. Another piece that I wanted to draw attention to was later on in that same bill that I've mentioned, there was a shifting of powers to the county commission. So county commissions have the authority whenever the governor, in this type of a state of emergency for COVID-19 related reasons, when the governor issues an order relating to the public health, and that's a very broad term, to the public health, they have the authority to, at the local level, make those orders less stringent. Okay, so the process that would look like is essentially they receive the order. At the county level, they would need to consult with their local health department, their health officials regarding it. The language of the bill says that they really don't even have to, all they have to do is consult. Even if the local health officials said, we really believe you must do these things, the county commission technically has the authority to go their own direction. So once they consider those, that guidance from the county health officials, they can issue a different order, and that order can be lesser. That order could be more stringent if they wanted to do that based off of the outbreak. And so all they would really have to do is issue an order with all of the relevant findings issued. Okay, so whatever that looks like could be impacted on the county level. One thing that we want to put in front of you all is just the concept that there is a danger, there's a bit of a liability struggle when you've been ordered something by an authority, government authority like the governor, based off of CDC and KDHE guidelines. If you choose not to follow that, and hopefully nothing terrible would happen, but if you chose not to follow that, and there was quite a cluster that broke out based off of school contact, and the knowledge was that you had not followed the orders, would you be set up for some sort of liability? I think potentially yes. So that's just something to keep in mind. So those are essentially the governor's powers, and those are the limits on her power. One thing that we believe is going to be addressed in the orders is that these orders probably won't have impact on traditional summer activities of the 2019-2020 school year. So what was communicated by the Commissioner of Education is that we anticipate that all of your summer activities, your summer school, your driver's education, your ESY type things can continue, that were, just a part of last year's education program. Okay, so we anticipate those can continue. I think also we would anticipate, at least in the short term, that those activities, strength and conditioning, camps and things like that that are currently happening probably can go on as long as your county health department hasn't put more restrictions in saying that you can't have gatherings of that size. So that's at least the information we've been given. Now that can always change with the governor's orders. I did want to mention just briefly, because there's a situation regarding paying hourly employees, and honestly with regard to paying your teachers as well, your licensed staff. So if you recall, last spring when the school districts were shut down, almost immediately there was legislation that came out and said, in order for you to apply for a waiver for the mandatory school term, so that mandatory school term looks like 1,116 hours for schools using the hourly system, and then there's a day system, I think it's 181 days for those schools. So we knew at that point that schools were not going to be able to operate those hours, and therefore they were given a mechanism through a waiver to get out of that. And what we saw through, I believe it was House substitute for Senate Bill 142, that said that essentially in order to apply for a waiver, you had to make assurances that you were going to go ahead and pay those employees. So granted, that made all kinds of new headaches, that was kind of a record-keeping nightmare, but we were ensured that people were to be paid. Now, people went ahead and applied for unemployment, and so we've been continuously working through all of that over the course of the last few months. Now, if you fast forward to now, we're talking July, August, September, what we have is a scenario where if schools are shut down, we may have some of our classified staff again that are not required to show up until September 9th. And so the question is going to be, do you go ahead and pay them for August? And Rod Spangler, that handles our benefits, our risk management group, was talking just a couple of days ago about, there's some unintended consequences because a lot of you provide health insurance benefits. So the payment for health insurance benefits would go through their August paychecks. So how does that continue? So there are some questions, and I did touch base with the general counsel at KSDE, the general counsel for the State Board of Ed. I shared those concerns with Scott Gordon, and he said he was compiling a list. He said there had been some discussions about waivers. He was unsure at this point if that would be a part of the special meeting with the state board, but just stay tuned for that. Hopefully we know more in the coming weeks. This is an ever-changing environment, and we'll just have to buckle up and give each other grace on the way through. I'm looking here to the chat. Dr. Jordan, did you see anything in the way of questions that I might have missed?
I cannot pull up the chat right here. Give me just a second. There we go.
Here, I've got it. And feel free, if you all have any questions, just drop them in there and I will try to handle them as best I can.
Mrs. Stallbaumer, one of the questions that there's 2 or 3 examples of this question. If the State Board of Education would comply with the governor's executive order, can the county override that order?
Mm-hmm. Right, that's a good question. I really think, looking at the language of the law, that the county commissioners have the authority to override any order having to do with public health. And honestly, at this point, looking at this scenario, if an order is made to limit school openings based on a COVID-19 outbreak, I think it's reasonable to assume that that would fall under their purview. So their authority is really pretty broad in a public health scenario like this. And I guess one more thing that I left off was that as the governor's authority was limited in the legislative session, our current state of disaster emergency only extends until September 15th. So past September 15th, the governor does not have any immediate authority to create more executive orders. Okay, so the governor would have to, at that point, essentially make a request to the State Finance Council, and that council would have to get together, and there would have to be at least 6 legislators voting in favor of expanding her authority into another time period. So it's not out of the question that that could happen, but just know that whatever order is issued, unless her authority is expanded, would essentially be ineffectual as of September 19th, or sorry, as of September 15th. So September 16th, when everyone shows up to school, if all things remain the same and your county didn't do anything to modify the governor's order on masks, for example, anything like that, then you are looking at a local control issue, because you have the authority at the local level to decide, are our people going to wear masks? What is the protocol with regard to all of these things? So if you look back to the Navigating Change document that we posted in the chat earlier, as Dr. Jordan said, it is a very long document. What I would recommend for all of you to do is to fast track. The link that I put in the chat actually takes you to almost a table of contents place on the State Department's website. And that's ideal because you can click on the portions that you want to read and digest. So I would recommend for all of you, knowing that I didn't come from an educational background, when I received this document, I went first to the operations piece, which starts on, I believe, page 1003 in the newest document that's posted. So if you fast track to 1003, you're going to have about 31 pages of operational guidance, and that'll talk to you about transportation and facilities and all of those key factors that I think you're going to have to think about as board members, because a lot of that will end in expenses, purchasing masks, purchasing sanitizer, how are we going to run our buses to maintain social distancing. All of those things will be concerns for you. Now, I as an attorney certainly don't want to tell you all to not read the whole document and memorize it if you want to, but I know personally it can be a little bit overwhelming. So I would recommend for all of you to pick a grade band. Think of a student that's in your life, whether it's a child, a grandchild, a friend. Think of a teacher that teaches a particular subject at a level, and go to that grade band and go to that subject matter and read through those. I think there's a lot of repetition throughout the document, and it really, I don't think it was meant for you to, except for probably our superintendents in the room, to read and you know, memorize all of those options. But just do a targeted read, try to digest those things, and you'll be more ready to discuss those home rule options. I do want to make clear that any deviance from the governor's orders, at least in the time where her orders are effective, falls on your county commissioners. There is no home rule authority for you, as long as those orders are in place, to do something less than that, if that makes sense. So you can absolutely get together as a board and formulate a plan for what it's going to look like moving forward from, you know, September 5th, September 16 on. And I think that's a great idea for continuity, that you know what you're going to do if the order becomes ineffective at that point.
Angie, there's a theme of some questions here in the chat related to, okay, so if our county commission decides to deviate from the executive order to wear masks, for example, could the school district say, you know, as a board, we want to establish the practice of all teachers and students over a certain age wearing masks? Because do they have the authority to do that if the county said we're not following that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is exactly what your home rule authority would allow you to do. And let me clarify that. What I want you to understand is whatever order that is governing your county, whether it's the governor's order or it's the order of the county commissioners, it is going to provide for minimums. So you can always elect on the local level in your own school board to do something more that provides more protections, okay? Now keep in mind some of those things that maybe are more restrictive than current guidance from the Department of Labor and all of those various places we need to think about, suggests may come with its own hiccups as far as staff and students, and there may be some parent pushback, but absolutely, if your county decided we're going to loosen up those requirements, but you felt like it was best for your district to go ahead and have people wear masks, that's within your authority to do that.
So kind of a follow-up question to that, there's two parts to this. We have districts out there that have their footprint of their district spans multiple counties. Any thoughts on how you maneuver through that if County A says we're not going to follow this, but County B says we're going to follow this? Is that just a conversation at the board table then deciding, okay, here's what we believe in the boundary that our kids reside? Is that how that plays out?
Yeah, so in that circumstance, and I know that's the case, I was thinking we had some districts that had lots of counties involved. So if that is the case, keep in mind that your buildings need to follow the restrictions given you. So if you have one building in one county and another building in the other county, you have to ensure that you're at least doing the minimums established by the order in each county. So as a school board member trying to manage that, what you could consider doing is elevating your response to at least the highest county. If you wanted to do that and keep it consistent, you absolutely could do that as far as following the guidelines of the county that's most restrictive. The other option would be just ensuring that the attendance centers are following whatever county rules are established in that county, if that makes sense, the county in which the attendance center is located.
Okay. Follow-up to that is, how do city councils play into this?
Good question. City councils do not have a decision-making role. They don't have veto power in this one. So, of course, city council could provide input, so this might be one of those situations where I believe Dr. Jordan showed a slide that talks about stakeholders, or he will, where it's wise for you to get together with your county officials, with your city officials, to discuss this about whether or not, I understand the prospect of a statewide fix not always being ideal. You may be in a county that has very little outbreak, so your considerations may be different than they are in Shawnee County or in Johnson County, Ford County, where the clusters are bigger. So I would just recommend at this point getting those groups together and starting the planning process of, if this is what this looks like, do we feel like a different local response is required?
So another follow-up question here, Angie. There's some questions in the chat related to, could the county choose to start school earlier if the governor and state board push it back to that September 9th? Or can the county only decide on the face mask and public health restrictions?
That's a good question.
Let's reemphasize that point, please.
Yeah, that is a good question. So, that's tricky. I believe I would look at this language to say that your county really does have broader authority than the state board. The problem with that is I don't like the concept of not abiding by state board, recommendations. So do I think legally you could do that? Yes. Do I think that might not be a wonderful look for you, that might be problematic if a waiver becomes a possibility or something? It may be. So just, you have to keep those factors in mind, but I do believe legally the county would have the authority, as long as the order given by the governor falls under that umbrella of public health, to do something lesser.
Angie, there's another question hanging out there that really kind of relates to what you just said. With the liability issue, would the liability issue be with the county or the individual school district, depending on the decisions they make?
Right. Honestly, I think it's going to go back to the school district, although the county could always get pulled in as a defendant in that, but most likely it's going to be the one that they believe caused the harm in the first place. So for liability purposes, it matters what you know, when did you know about it, and what did you do with that information. So now keep in mind, workers' comp, the law around infectious disease is not, usually those types of things that are viruses are not something that there have been a lot of cases giving liability to different entities for. That's why workers' comp doesn't really cover viruses usually, because there's no telling where this person absolutely contracted this thing. It's easier in the case where somebody has conditions resulting from asbestos, and there was asbestos in the school building. You didn't take care of that problem. I became sick as a result. So with viruses, it's harder to pinpoint the point of contraction. But I do believe there's the option for these types of things to start popping up, for these types of lawsuits to come about. So what you need to do is make sure that you're not acting with deliberate indifference. So if there is clear guidance given, and granted, you could always make that argument that we did not have a cluster in this county at this time. So the clear guidance given was at the state level, based on state rates, and those did not apply to us at the time. But given the information you had, did you know the right path to take and you neglected to take it or acted in the face of relevant guidance applying to you? I think the fact that your county commissioners, based off of your local health department, chose to go a different route would at least be beneficial to you, as long as they were following the guidance of the county health officials at the time. So that's why I think we all have to have our ear connected to the, those discussions happening with county health. So any recommendation that you might make as a superintendent or as a board member still needs to be done in concert with what's happening in your county from a health perspective.
So a couple, and this is going to be a hard question because I think it will probably come back to a local conversation. At this time, there's not necessarily a mechanism in place, and Dr. Watson emphasized yesterday, he does not see a waiver being put in place to waive the 1,116 hours. Mm-hmm. There's some questions, multiple questions out there in the chat, Angie, related to, do we pay our hourly employees then for those 3 weeks that we would have been in school, or do we only pay based on when we start school? And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. One of the things you got to remember is you're going to have to make up that time somewhere, so you may need that staff at some point. So I have to think about the budgetary constraints that you may be under if you choose to make payment, or if you can even legally make payment without people performing the work. So Angie, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. So as far as the law is concerned, there is no express order for you right now to pay those hourly people for those hours. Now, keep in mind, you all may have contracts in place. So if you have contracts in place saying that their start date was such and such date in August, technically you would have, guaranteeing them pay on regular pay dates and things like that. You may have a contractual obligation to pay them for that unless you take measures to, effectuate a suspension or a furlough or something like that. But legally, there's no guidance saying you have to pay those people for those hours. What I would tell you, though, is that I would anticipate, and we've already heard some school districts that are receiving unemployment claims for those 3 weeks. Okay, so if you choose not to pay your staff, if you are electing to pay your staff for that time period, I would let them know that that's the way you're going to go. So at least you aren't fighting those unemployment claims at the same time as you're paying them, because we've seen that play out in gory detail in the last few months. So that's an option for you, but absolutely keep in mind that part of what may happen under this scenario is you may crack back open your negotiated agreement. You may end up moving some professional duty days around. Yeah, professional development could be moved to the front. So if you want to front load all of your professional development days and you can get the flexibility to do that with your negotiated agreement, I think there's about a week and a half of that professional development that you can count towards those hours. So you may be doing some fancy things with your calendaring that would impact the school year, or add time to the end of the school year, or add days that otherwise would have been a fall break, or the Monday after Easter, or something like that that you would traditionally take off. So as Dr. Jordan said, there is absolutely the opportunity that you will still in the end pay them for all of those days. It just may be moved to a different time.
So a couple of key points you mentioned there. You can bring staff in for professional development in that period of time before September 9th. Professional development time counts as halftime towards those 1,116 hours. So there is an opportunity there to make up some of that time. I think that's a wise move given all the changes that we're going to be experiencing as we try to reopen schools. We're kind of bumping up against our time here of 1:30, so I want to move forward. I will put a plug in some of the conversations that we just got into around paying staff. On Monday at 2 o'clock, we have an HR payroll clerks forum where they can get on. We'll have Luke Soba on with us, and we'll be talking in detail around some strategies for handling these situations that we know are going to be popping up. So we're going to move forward here and touch on just a few more things before we finish up. We've tried to emphasize throughout the session today that communication is critical. We know that as we lead through these unprecedented times, communication is going to suffer, culture will suffer, your order will be disrupted, and people need to have an opportunity to provide input. Communication obviously includes listening as well as getting information out there. On the slide that you see up here, these are some key groups that need to be included in your process of gathering that input to develop plans and to reopen your schools safely for your students and your staff. We also have put together some sessions for next week, Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday evening. We are doing regional roundtable discussions with this topic, but taking a little bit deeper dive. So we're going to spend some time unpacking CCOI. We know the challenges that you're facing as board members, being asked a multitude of questions that there is no right answer to. There's no known path forward that's ever been explored before. We believe that communication is critical in these times and keeping people focused on how we're communicating, how we're gathering input. Our KSB board members have asked us to continue to develop opportunities to bring folks together and talk about how they're doing that. The graphic that you see up here on the right-hand side of the screen, that's the general parts of your system. We put together a guiding document out there titled Roadmap to Reopening, where we give you some guiding questions in each of the 4 areas of students, educational program, physical plant personnel, guiding questions that we believe are critical for that planning body within your district to consider as they think about the students, you think about their needs and the safety of your staff as you try to reopen your schools. I will remind you just to go out to our website. On our front page, you'll see a section out there titled Roadmap to Reopening. If you click on that link, that's going to drop you over to a whole litany of resources. That Roadmap to Reopening framework that I was just talking about that has students, educational programming personnel, and physical plant, that document is there. I'd encourage you to take a look at that. There's some great guiding questions in there. There's also some key communication pieces that you need to consider as it relates to CCOI. I want to thank you all for jumping on today. It's been great to see all your faces, and hopefully you found an opportunity to engage with fellow board members. There's future opportunities coming up. We will have another one of these overview sessions. It will be the same exact program on Wednesday at noon. So if you want to jump on, and Gary's going to lead that session, we're going to use the same material, but it'll be the same 90-minute session where you can jump on and discuss with fellow board members. We also have some regional roundtables that we put together for Monday night, Wednesday night, and Thursday night for you to get on and talk regionally with what other board members are looking at, how they're starting to develop their plans or steps that they're taking. And then finally, we're going to continue to do our Wednesday noon forums. We've over the summer kind of just done those once a month. We're going to ramp those back up and continue to do those Wednesdays at noon. Those are free. It's going to be an opportunity for us to keep you up to date and in the loop around what's changing at the state level, and hopefully share insights from what districts are doing to safely reopen schools. Again, I want to thank you all for coming in today or jumping on today to engage in these conversations, and I thank you for your support of the kids of Kansas. Take care.